Okay, so jungle camping. Solo. Sounds like a recipe for either amazing Instagram stories or a really bad horror movie, right? Well, guess which one I was aiming for when I decided to book that trip to Borneo. Instagram, obviously. I mean, picture it, me hammock strung between two giant trees, dappled sunlight, maybe a monkey photobombing a selfie. Total influencer goals. Except, spoiler alert, reality is way messier than Instagram filters. It started out pretty idyllic. I'm not gonna lie. The flight was long, obviously, and then there was the Jeep ride that felt like it was designed to shake your internal organs loose. But when I finally got to the edge of the jungle, it was breathtaking. Like, actually breathtaking. In that way nature sometimes is that makes you feel small and insignificant, but also kind of awesome for being a tiny part of something so huge. The air was thick and humid, like walking into a warm, damp towel, and the smell was insane. Earthy and green and a little bit feral. In a good way, I thought at the time. My guide, a local guy named Ben, was super chill. He helped me lug my backpack, which, let's be honest, was way too big and heavy for a lightweight camping trip. And we trekked into the jungle for a couple of hours. He pointed out all sorts of cool stuff, crazy looking bugs the size of my thumb, plants that could cure diseases or kill you, he added with a grin, and the sounds of birds I'd never heard before. It was like stepping into a National Geographic documentary, but you know, real and sweaty. Very, very sweaty. We finally reached this clearing he'd picked out for my campsite. It was perfect. A small patch of relatively flat ground nestled between these massive trees, with a little stream babbling nearby. Ben helped me set up my tent, which, thank God, was one of those pop-up ones, because I am not about wrestling with poles and instructions in the middle of nowhere, and strung up my hammock. He showed me how to use my little portable stove and gave me a crash course in Jungle Survival 101, which mostly consisted of don't touch anything you don't recognize. And if you hear a weird noise, make a louder noise. Solid advice. Then he left, just like that. 1 minute he was there, showing me how to hang my food bag so monkeys wouldn't steal my snacks. And the next, he was waving goodbye and disappearing back into the green wall of the jungle. And suddenly, it was just me, alone, in the middle of the Borneo rainforest. Okay, maybe alone isn't exactly right. I mean, the jungle was definitely not empty. It was buzzing and chirping and rustling and humming with life. But human life? Nope, just me. The first few hours were actually pretty great. I set up my little camp chair, brewed some coffee, and just chilled in my hammock, reading a book and soaking it all in. The sun filtered through the leaves, making these cool patterns on the ground, and the sounds of the jungle were actually kind of soothing, like nature's white noise machine. I even saw a couple of monkeys swinging through the trees, which was exactly the Instagram moment I'd been hopping for. I snapped a bunch of pictures, obviously, making sure to get the perfect angle and filter. Jungle life, solo adventure, Borneo baby, living my best life. You know the drill. As the sun started to dip lower, though, things started to feel a little different. The light changed, turning everything a deeper, richer green, and the shadows got longer and creepier. The sounds of the jungle also shifted. The chirping birds quieted down, replaced by a chorus of, well, I didn't really know what they were. Croaking, clicking, buzzing things. Nocturnal jungle creatures, I guessed. Probably just insects and frogs and stuff. But they sounded louder, more insistent. I made dinner dehydrated backpacking food that tasted vaguely of chicken and sadness, and ate it sitting by the stream, watching the last of the light fade. It got dark really fast. Like 1 minute it was twilight, and the next it was pitch black, except for the beam of my headlamp. And that's when the jungle really came alive. The noises intensified. The croaking and clicking and buzzing were joined by rustling in the undergrowth, snapping twigs, and something else. Something bigger. Something moving around in the trees above me. I shone my headlamp up into the canopy, but all I saw were leaves and branches. Nothing moving. Probably just the wind, I told myself. Or monkeys settling down for the night. Or maybe a really big squirrel. Yeah, a jungle squirrel. Totally normal. I retreated to my tent. It felt a lot smaller and less secure in the dark. The thin fabric walls suddenly seemed like no protection at all from whatever was out there. I zipped myself in, feeling a little ridiculous for being so jumpy. It was just the jungle, right? Nature, peaceful and serene. Except it didn't feel peaceful and serene anymore. It felt watchful, like something was out there in the darkness, looking at me. I tried to read, but I couldn't concentrate. Every rustle, every snap, every chirp made me jump. I kept shining my headlamp around the inside of the tent, checking for, I don't even know what. Spiders, snakes, jungle monsters. My imagination was definitely running wild. I told myself I was being stupid. It was just the dark. Darkness always makes things seem scarier than they are. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. Or at least, I think I did. It was a restless, uneasy sleep, filled with strange dreams, and punctuated by sudden awakenings at every little noise. I'd lie there in the dark, heart pounding, listening to the jungle sounds, trying to convince myself it was all normal, just nature doing its thing. Sometime in the middle of the night, I have no idea what time it was. It was just black. I woke up to a sound that wasn't normal. It wasn't a rustle or a snap or a chirp. It was a sigh. A long, drawn-out sigh, right outside my tent, like someone or something was standing there, just breathing. My blood ran cold. I froze, holding my breath, listening. Silence. Just the usual jungle noises, the insects buzzing, the stream babbling. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind, except there wasn't any wind. The air was still and heavy. Then I heard it again. Another sigh, closer this time. And this time, it wasn't just a sigh. It was wet, like a wet sigh. like someone sighing through drool. Okay, that's gross, I know, but that's what it sounded like. A wet, slobbery sigh right outside my tent wall. My heart was hammering in my chest. I fumbled for my headlamp, switched it on, and pointed it at the tent wall where I'd heard the sound. Nothing, just the thin nylon fabric. No shadow, no movement, no anything. Just the tent wall. I held my breath again, listening. Silence. Had I imagined it? Was I just freaking myself out? Maybe I was just really tired and my ears were playing tricks on me. Yeah, that had to be it. Jungle fatigue. It's a thing, right? I was about to switch off my headlamp and try to go back to sleep when I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a sigh. It was a sniff, like an animal sniffing the air. A big animal, sniffing right outside my tent. Okay, this was definitely not my imagination. Something was out there. Something big enough to make a loud sniffing sound. And it was right next to my tent. I could practically feel its breath on the other side of the fabric. Terror, pure and cold, flooded through me. My mind raced. What could it be? A jaguar, a wild boar, a bear? Were there even bears in Borneo? I had no idea. All I knew was that something big and unknown was outside my tent, and I was completely alone and vulnerable inside. I stayed frozen, paralyzed by fear, listening to the sniffing sounds. They went on for what felt like forever, circling the tent, getting closer, then moving away, then closer again. It was like whatever it was investigating me, sniffing me out, trying to figure out what I was. Then the sniffing stopped. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't the normal jungle silence. It was a heavy, expectant silence, like something was holding its breath, waiting, watching. And then I heard it. A low growl, deep and guttural and rumbling. It vibrated through the ground, through the tent, through my bones. It was close, very close, right outside my tent. This wasn't a squirrel. This wasn't a monkey. This was something big and dangerous, something predatory, and it was right there. And I was trapped inside a flimsy nylon tent with nothing to defend myself. Panic seized me. My breath came in short, gasping breaths. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my headlamp. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just lie there and wait for whatever it was to what? Tear through the tent. Eat me alive. The thought made me want to scream, but I clamped my hand over my mouth, terrified of making any noise that would attract its attention. I remembered Ben's advice. If you hear a weird noise, make a louder noise. Okay, brilliant. But what kind of noise? I didn't have a horn or a whistle or anything like that. All I had was me. And my voice. Could I scream? Would that scare it away? Or would it just make it angrier, hungrier? I didn't know, but I couldn't just do nothing. I had to try something. Taking a deep breath, I ripped open the zipper of my tent and scrambled out. I know, probably the stupidest thing I could have done. But I was panicking. And in my panicked brain, running seemed like a better option than staying trapped in the tent. I burst out of the tent, headlamp beams sweeping wildly around, expecting to see I don't know what. A pair of glowing eyes, sharp teeth, claws, but there was nothing, just darkness, and trees, and shadows, and the sounds of the jungle, which suddenly seemed to have gone quiet. Eerily quiet. Had it gone? Had I scared it away by coming out of the tent? Or was it still there, hiding in the shadows, watching me? I spun around, headlamp beam dancing through the trees, trying to see anything at all. But there was nothing. Except something felt different. The air felt heavier. The silence felt charged. Like the jungle itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then I saw it. Or rather, I saw them. Eyes, 2 pairs of eyes reflecting the beam of my headlamp, glowing in the darkness, high up in the trees, watching me. They weren't animal eyes. They were too bright, too intense, and they were too high up. Higher than any animal I could think of. Higher than a monkey. Higher than a jaguar. Jaguars don't climb that high, do they? My heart pounded in my chest. I stared at the eyes, frozen again, unable to move, unable to breathe. They just stared back, unblinking, unwavering. And then slowly they started to move. Not away, closer, coming down from the trees. And as they moved, I started to see more. Not just eyes, shapes, dark shapes moving in the shadows. Slender, elongated shapes, twisting and turning as they moved. Like snakes, but bigger, much bigger. And upright. No, that couldn't be right. Snakes don't walk upright. Snakes don't have glowing eyes. Snakes don't watch you from the trees. Unless these weren't snakes. The shapes moved closer, emerging from the shadows, into the edge of my headlamp beam. And I saw what they were. And what I saw made my blood run colder than ice. They were figures, humanoid figures, but not human, not quite. They were tall and slender, with long, spindly limbs and thin, elongated torsos. Their skin was pale and smooth, almost translucent, reflecting the dim light like polished bone. And their heads were wrong. They were too small, too narrow, with faces that were blank, featureless, except for the eyes, those glowing, intense eyes. They moved with a strange, fluid grace, gliding through the undergrowth, their limbs bending and twisting in ways that didn't seem natural. They didn't make a sound. No rustling leaves, no snapping twigs, no breathing. Just silent, gliding movement. And those eyes, fixed on me, burning into me. There were 4 of them, 4 of these things, surrounding my campsite, slowly closing in. And I was standing there in the middle of them, frozen with terror, my headlamp beam shaking in my trembling hand. What were they? Where did they come from? What did they want? My mind screamed questions, but there were no answers. Only fear, pure, primal fear. One of the figures moved closer, stepping into the full beam of my headlamp. It was even more horrifying up close. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones. Its limbs were unnaturally thin and long, and its face, it was like a mask. A smooth, pale mask with 2 black holes for eyes, glowing with an inner light. It raised one of its long, spindly arms and pointed a finger at me. A long, pale, skeletal finger. and then it opened its mouth. And what came out wasn't a growl or a hiss or any animal sound. It was a voice that was cold and whispery and utterly alien. A voice that seemed to resonate not in my ears, but in my bones. Lost, it whispered. The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Lost, lost. Was that what they thought I was? Lost. I wanted to scream, to shout, to tell them to go away, to leave me alone. But no sound came out of my throat. I was paralyzed, voiceless, trapped in a nightmare. The figure took another step closer. Alone, it whispered again. Alone and lost. And then it did something that made my heart stop. It smiled. Or at least, I think it smiled. Its lips, thin and pale, stretched back, revealing rows of small, sharp, needle-like teeth. It wasn't a human smile. It was something else. Something predatory. Something hungry. Join us, it whispered. Join us in the dark. Join them in the dark. What did that even mean? Were they going to kill me? Eat me? Turn me into one of them? I didn't want to find out. I didn't want to join them. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape. But I was surrounded, trapped. But then something shifted. One of the other figures moved, stepping forward from the shadows. This one was slightly different. Slightly smaller, slightly less skeletal. And its eyes weren't glowing as brightly. They were dimmer, softer, almost sad. This figure stepped in front of the first one, blocking it from me. It turned to face the first figure, and then it spoke. And its voice, though still whispery and alien, was different. It was softer, gentler. No, it whispered. She is not lost. She is curious. Curious. Was that what I was? Curious. Maybe I had been at the beginning. Curious about the jungle. Curious about solo camping. But now I was just terrified. I wanted to be anywhere but here. The first figure hissed, a low, angry sound. She is alone. She is weak. She is prey. The second figure shook its head. Or at least, I think it shook its head. Its movements were so subtle, so alien, it was hard to tell. No, it whispered again. She is different. She watches. Watches. What was it talking about? I was watching them, yes. But only because I was terrified. I didn't want to watch them. I wanted to run away. The two figures stood facing each other, whispering in their strange, alien language. The other two figures remained silent, watching me with their glowing eyes. I stood there, frozen, caught in the middle of this bizarre, terrifying confrontation, not knowing what was happening, not knowing what to do. Then, the second figure turned back to me. It reached out a long, pale hand and pointed not at me, but at my backpack, which was lying on the ground near my tent. "What is this?" it whispered, its voice filled with a strange, childlike curiosity. "This skin. It was pointing at my backpack. My backpack wasn't skin, it was nylon. Waterproof nylon. But maybe to them it looked like skin. Like some kind of strange, artificial skin. I managed to find my voice, a weak, trembling whisper. "It's a backpack," I said, "for carrying things." The figure tilted its head, its blank face unreadable. Carrying things, it repeated, as if trying to understand the concept. Like prey, prey. Was that what they thought backpacks were for? Carrying prey? Oh God, were they hunters? Were they going to hunt me? Put me in their backpacks? No, I stammered. Not prey, just things, clothes, food. A book. I gestured weakly at my backpack, hoping they would understand. Hoping they wouldn't eat me. The second figure stepped closer to my backpack, its glowing eyes fixed on it. It reached out a finger and touched the nylon fabric, lightly, tentatively. Soft, it whispered. Like spider silk, spider silk. Okay, now they were just being weird. My backpack was not like spider silk. It was, well, it was nylon. But maybe they didn't have nylon in the jungle. Maybe they only had spider silk to compare it to. The figure turned back to me, its eyes still fixed on my face. And this, it whispered, pointing at my headlamp, which was still clutched in my hand. This light, my headlamp. Yeah, it was a headlamp, for seeing in the dark, which ironically wasn't helping me see these things any better, just made their eyes glow more creepily. It's a light, I said again, my voice a little stronger this time, for seeing in the dark. The figure tilted its head again, considering this. Seeing in the dark, it repeated. Like us, like them. Did they see in the dark? Were they nocturnal? Was that why they were out here at night? Were they jungle creatures? But they didn't look like animals. They looked like something else. Something ancient. Something not quite human. The second figure turned to the first figure and whispered something in their alien language. The first figure hissed again, but this time it sounded less angry, more hesitant. The second figure turned back to me, its eyes softer now, almost curious. You are strange, it whispered. You are alone, but you are not prey. You are watcher. Watcher, me, a watcher. What did that even mean? I wasn't watching anything except them out of sheer terror. I was just a tourist. A stupid tourist who thought solo camping in the jungle would be a good idea. We watch too, the figure continued. We watch the jungle. We watch the changes. We watch the light. The changes, the light. What were they watching? The seasons, the weather, the deforestation. Oh God, were they jungle spirits? Guardians of the forest, angry at humans for destroying their home. A wave of guilt washed over me. I felt suddenly ashamed of my stupid Instagram ambitions, my careless intrusion into their world. I had come here for selfies and hashtags, and I had stumbled into something ancient and terrifying and sad. We are leaving, the second figure whispered. You stay, watch, learn, leaving. They were leaving, just like that. After terrifying me half to death, they were just going to leave. I couldn't believe it. I didn't dare to believe it. The second figure turned to the other figures and whispered something again. Then, slowly, gracefully, they began to move away, gliding back into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness of the jungle. One by one, they vanished, until only the silence remained. And then, even the silence faded, replaced by the normal sounds of the jungle, the chirping insects, the rustling leaves, the babbling stream. It was like they had never been there, like it had all been a hallucination, a nightmare. But it hadn't been a dream. It had been real. I had seen them. Those pale, slender figures with their glowing eyes and whispery voices. I had stood face to face with something ancient and unknown, something that watched the jungle, something that called itself Watcher. I stood there for a long time, trembling, heart still pounding, headlamp beam still shaking in my hand, staring into the darkness where they had disappeared, trying to make sense of what had just happened, trying to convince myself it had been real. Eventually, slowly, the fear began to recede, replaced by a strange mix of awe and respect. Respect for the jungle, for its mysteries, for its hidden inhabitants. Respect for those watchers, whatever they were. I switched off my headlamp, plunging myself into darkness. But this time, the darkness didn't feel so terrifying. It felt different, charged, alive, like I was sharing it with something else, something ancient and watchful. I crawled back into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down, still shaking. But this time, I didn't feel so alone. I felt watched, but not in a threatening way, more in a curious way, like the jungle itself was watching me, like the watchers were still out there in the darkness, observing me, learning about me, just as I was learning about them. I didn't sleep much that night, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I was awake to the mysteries of the jungle, to the secrets hidden in the shadows, to the watchers who moved unseen. And I knew, somehow, that I would never look at the jungle or at the world in the same way again. The next morning, Ben came back to pick me up. He found me sitting by the stream, drinking coffee, looking out at the jungle with new eyes. He asked me how my night had been. I just smiled, a slow, knowing smile. It was interesting, I said. Very interesting. I didn't tell him about the watchers. I knew he wouldn't believe me. Or maybe he would. Maybe the locals knew about them. Maybe they were part of the jungle lore, whispered about in hushed tones around campfires. I didn't ask. Some things are better left unsaid. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some secrets are best kept hidden in the darkness of the jungle, watched over by the silent, glowing eyes of the watchers. As we hiked back out of the jungle, I looked back one last time at the green wall of trees, at the shadows that danced beneath the canopy. And I knew deep down that I wasn't really leaving the jungle behind. A part of me would always remain there, in the darkness, watching, learning, listening to the whispers of the watchers. And I knew, too, that I would never truly be alone again. Not as long as the jungle existed and the watchers watched. And somehow, that wasn't such a scary thought anymore. It was something else, something bigger, something wild, and maybe, just maybe, something a little bit magical. And that, I guess, is a story worth more than any Instagram post.